With an eye on long-term sustainability, we need to be mindful of the challenges of both grass weeds and, I think, wetter autumns. And I know the non-plough systems are probably more challenged by these two factors. And whilst they do bring certain benefits with work rates, etc., we do need to be conscious that ploughing will be a very, very important tool to have in our toolbox going forward.
You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. This week, we're going to circle back to the National Tillage Conference, where we had a number of really interesting talks. We're going to focus on the trade-offs between establishment systems with Jack Jameson, and also the problem of weeds with Charlotte Morgan. And first, let's hear from Jack Jameson, who will talk about the trade-off of crop establishment techniques between min-till, plough, and direct drill systems.
So for part of my PhD, I've been looking at the performance of plough, min-till and direct drill systems, and to that end we had three main research objectives. The focus of today's presentation is the first objective, and that was to try and compare the on-farm and control trial performance of these crop establishment systems. The other objectives were to examine the economic performance of these systems and to try and model the soil carbon change in these systems over time. So to address the objectives, we had two main studies. So we had the Knockbeg trial and an on-farm study. So taking the Knockbeg trial first, Dermot spoke about it earlier. So it's a large long-term experiment looking at the impact of system and rotation in combination. And within that larger trial, I was monitoring crops of first wheat, followed after winter oilseed rape. So in this crop of first wheat, the input levels and management for each system were identical, and we had 4 replications of each system or treatment. And this layout or design allowed us to directly compare the performance of each of the systems. And then looking at the on-farm study, so we had 21 farms in this study, 7 each of plough, min-till and direct drill. Again, similar to Knockbeg, we were looking at crops of first wheat. However, there was large variations in both the soils, the input levels and the management from farm to farm. And these variations meant that we couldn't directly compare the performance of the systems in this study, but the on-farm study was invaluable in terms of seeing the range of both performances and management on farms, and both of these studies were over the last 3 growing seasons. Okay, so to look at some results now, so taking establishment counts first. So in Knockbeg, all 3 systems were sown on the same date in the middle of October and at the same seeding rate. So when the management was the same, what we seen was direct drill establishment counts were significantly lower in 2 out of the 3 study seasons. However, all 3 systems, as we can see, did achieve adequate establishment counts to support yield potential, which was very encouraging. Now, to compare that with what we've seen on farms, so just to explain about what we're seeing here, so I suppose every triangle, square and circle represents an establishment count from a farm in one of the 3 study seasons, and then the black diamonds here represents the average for each of the systems. So on farms there was high variability in establishment counts on the farms, but as we can see, most of the farms achieved very similar and adequate establishment counts to support yield potential. Now the difference with what we've seen in Knockbeg is that direct drill doesn't seem to have lower establishment counts than the other systems. Now this is mainly because direct drill growers were sowing 2 to 3 weeks earlier and were using higher seeding rates to try and, I suppose, counteract the poor establishment or the risk of poor establishment we've seen in Knockbeg. So now we're going to have a quick look at some growth data, taking Knockbeg first. So what we measured was light interception. Now light interception is measured because the more light a crop is intercepting, I suppose the more growth that has occurred across the season. And we've growth stages across the bottom here. So what we found in Knockbeg was that direct drill, I suppose, suffered from slower early season growth, but generally speaking caught up by growth stage 37 or flag leaf emergence. To compare that with what we've seen on farms, I suppose on farms growth was very variable within systems but comparable across systems. So as we can see, there's no great difference amongst the systems from what we can see here. The difference with what we've seen in Knockbeg is that direct drill didn't appear to suffer from slower early season growth. Now this is probably because with the sowing 2 to 3 weeks earlier and with the higher seeding rates, larger canopies were being carried into the winter, meaning there was less ground to be made up come springtime here in growth stage 21 and growth stage 30. Now, yields, all important and interesting. So I suppose in Knockbeg, which was very, very encouraging, there was no statistical difference in yield across the 3 seasons. And I suppose you could see very good yields were achieved. On farms, things were a little bit different. So I suppose before we get into it, all the fields in the study years achieved very reasonable yields. But as we can see, direct drill yields or direct drill sites did seem to yield that little bit lower. However, this was mainly down to management, we think. So direct drill growers, in this study anyway, were using significantly lower levels of inputs. Now this was embodied by, on average, a use of 20% less chemical nitrogen. So these growers are purposely choosing to use lower levels of input. So it'll be interesting once the economic analysis comes around to see, does this reduced spend on inputs compensate for some of the yield depression we're seeing. In terms of key messages to conclude, so on-farm studies versus research trials. On-farm studies, so they were very interesting, very, very useful to see the range of both performances and management on farms. However, it was very challenging to compare the systems in this way due to the variation we've seen from farm to farm. And then in terms of Knockbeg or the replicated research trials, so they are limited in the number of factors we can look at in them, but they're still essential to compare the performance of these systems. And then in terms of the establishment systems themselves, so as we've seen in Knockbeg, which was very encouraging, these systems were all capable of producing similar yields. However, with an eye on long-term sustainability, we need to be mindful of the challenges of both grass weeds and, I think, wetter autumns. And I know the non-plough systems are probably more challenged by these 2 factors, and whilst they do bring certain benefits with work rates, etc., we do need to be conscious that ploughing will be a very, very important tool to have in our toolbox going forward. So I'd like to thank all the growers for participating, of which some I see here, and everyone else who were involved. So thank you.
And thanks to Jack for that. It was a really good comparison between those systems. We'll now head across to Charlotte Morgan, who's going to talk about the growing problem of trying to control poppies in tillage systems.
So why can poppies become such a problematic weed? Well, firstly, they're both autumn and spring germinating. They are a very competitive plant, and from a resistance perspective, they're actually the 3rd most important weed in Europe, right after blackgrass and Italian ryegrass. And this is due to the fact that they are cross-pollinating, they create high seed bank populations, and they also have a longevity of what's estimated to be greater than 10 years. And finally, they can evolve both target site and non-target site resistant mechanisms, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So what are our herbicide options for controlling poppies? Well, some of these are just examples, but what I really want to focus on are the modes of action that are available for us. So firstly, you have your ALS inhibiting herbicides. So the likes of Camiomax, Alimax, and Pacifica Plus, these are your SUs. And then you have a slightly different chemistry in Broadway Star, but it is still an ALS inhibitor. Then available to us are hormones or synthetic auxins, so the likes of Pixaro with that newer chemistry Aralex in there. And you can also have a combination of both of these, so a hormone and an ALS inhibitor in one, which is something that we see in the likes of Zypar. Now these are all predominantly used in cereal crops, so for non-cereal crops such as winter oilseed rape, we have the options of something such as AstroCurb. So before the 2022 harvest, we received 2 suspect-resistant populations of poppies, one from Meath and one from Kildare. When we received these seeds, they were grown in a glasshouse, and they were sprayed with herbicides at the 4 to 6 leaf stage. So this is pretty optimal conditions. Now the results I'll be showing you will be from 4 different ALS herbicide trials. And when we sprayed these herbicides, we actually sprayed them at a variety of doses, from just a quarter of the recommended field rate all the way up to 8 times the recommended field rate. And this range really allows us to examine the extent of resistance in both populations. So the next couple of photos that I'm going to show all follow the same format. So our 2 rows are our 2 populations, the top one being from Meath and the bottom from Kildare. And as we move from left to right, we go from an untreated, unsprayed control plant all the way up through the doses to 8 times the recommended field rate. And that field rate is indicated there by that red 1x. Now, this photo was taken looking down on the poppies in the trays in which they were grown and sprayed. So if we look at the effects of Broadway star first, we can see it's not until about 1.5 to 2 times the recommended field rate until we start to see control of the two populations. Now, that's obviously above the legal limit that we're allowed to use in field, so if we focus in on that field rate, we can see that there is still growth in both populations, and this indicates some sort of tolerance or resistance. Now, if we look at Alimax and the effects on our two populations, we can see that even up to 8 times the recommended field rate, there's very, very little control, and there's still strong growing plants in both populations. And we can say the same for Cameo Max. At 8x the recommended field rate, still very strong growing plants. And finally, we saw the same again with Pacifica Plus. These 3 herbicides were virtually ineffective on both of these populations. And what I wanted to know is, why does this happen? So I started to look at target site resistance. Now, I'm not going to bore you with too much of the genetics of it all, but when a herbicide is sprayed on a sensitive plant, it can find its target in the plant and bind effectively, and this is what results in plant death. Now, how we look at this is, we look at the gene that creates the target. So with ALS inhibitors, we looked at the ALS gene. And this is something that we saw in all of our sensitive poppies, this sort of code here. Now, when a plant evolves target site resistance, that target has changed its structure so much that the herbicide can't bind to it anymore. And this is why we see strong growing resistant plants. And in all of the plants we looked at in both populations, we found mutation in the ALS gene. And at this position, this mutation actually infers resistance to ALS herbicides. So this explains exactly what we just saw in the glasshouse. So what can we take from this? Well, firstly, these two populations have evolved target site resistance to ALS herbicides. And these two populations are actually the first cases of herbicide resistance that have been identified and verified molecularly in Ireland. Presumably, there are a few more out there. So we need to be vigilant with our weeds and herbicide efficacy, and resistance testing is critical. In the field, we can't rely solely on ALS herbicides. So using alternative modes of action is crucial. So if our target weeds are poppies, using a hormone-type herbicide can be very effective. And finally, integrated weed management approaches. These are crucial in the field, such as cultural control methods. They can really help to alleviate weed pressure. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you to everyone involved in the project. Just a quick reminder that if you do think you have a problem with resistance in your field, we do offer free herbicide resistance testing in Oak Park. Thanks for listening.
So that's it for this week. So if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.